So we know that the earth is in crisis, and we know that there are multiple sets of crisis: financial crisis, economic crisis, poverty crisis, water crisis, and various kinds of crisis. So what is at stake in these negotiations are very fundamental questions. What we see is a shift that's been happening at least for many years now, a weakening of the collective ability of us all, developed and developing countries, to address climate change. Many have termed this a deregulation of the rule-based system, and we've just come out of a crisis that was the result of another set, in fact, many years of deregulation of economic and financial system, and we know what the ultimate effect of deregulation and rampant deregulation can be. So we ought to be worried about deregulation of the climate regime. But at the same time that there is this push, this impetus towards deregulation, there is a process of re-regulation. And it's a re-regulation of the existing framework to force developing countries to take on mitigation obligations. At the same time, developed countries are allowed to escape from their commitments in the convention to mitigate, to provide finance and technology transfer. So we have the process of deregulating of Annex 1 or developed countries from their obligation, but there is a process of re-regulation, of building a set of mechanism that actually encompasses binding obligations and stringent obligations of developing countries that is quite contrary to the principles of the convention. In terms of developing countries that take on NAMAs, International Consultation Alliance, assessment, and various other mechanisms of that. So in this framework where we've said that there is a climate crisis, there is this contradictory effort at deregulation on the part of developed countries and re-regulation on those countries' part for developing countries into a system and in violation of the convention. Is there a role for principles such as equity, common but differentiated responsibility in this context? What do we have to say about mitigation gap, development gap, adaptation gap, finance gap? How do those link to ambition? And how do those link in the negotiation? Are we at a stage in our evolution that we can say that we will jettison all principles, whether it's equity, CBDR, because there's a planetary crisis? And when do we begin to unravel human rights, indigenous rights, and women's rights also on those grounds? So we have very serious questions that we must face. And we have here a stellar panel of experts, long committed to these struggles, struggle for balance and justice in the climate regime. And so I'd like to ask Matthew Stilwell to address the questions of whether or not in this current situation there is a role for equity, CBDR, and all of the principles that we have evolved as human society.